And also, the outbreak of this virus has very badly impacted the economy, especially in China and indeed around the world. And to discuss more in terms of what's been happening, because remember, this is something that's going to have a long, lingering kind of an impact. It was 2 months ago that a 34-year-old Chinese doctor had warned the world about the possibility of another viral outbreak. This was somewhere in the middle of December. At that time, the authorities had completely dismissed him as a fearmongerer, and they'd also accused him of spreading rumors. Today, he stands vindicated, but in a very tragic manner. He, unfortunately, has succumbed to the same infection that he had flagged up in the month of December, and he's now died due to this very viral infection. Li Wenliang's death was reported by the Wuhan Central Hospital a little after 3 a.m. local time in China, but now there is a controversy that surrounds his death. State-backed Chinese media had already reported his death on Thursday, hours before it was confirmed by the hospital. Under pressure, China's anti-graft watchdog has ordered for a probe into Li's death. The Discipline Inspection Commission will be visiting Wuhan to conduct an intensive investigation into all issues raised by the people. This, of course, is something that has dented China's image to a certain extent. It has to do a lot of firefighting in terms of how it goes about bringing this coronavirus outbreak under control. And the focus also is now on the economy in terms of how all of this, of course, will impact the economy. And to discuss more on this, we are joined in by Mr. Robert Kelly, who is joining us live from Seoul in South Korea. Mr. Kelly, this is a bolt out of the blue. 2 months back, no one expected something like this. But right now, it appears that China is perhaps going through one of its worst crises in over a decade.
Yeah, that's right. I think if the Chinese manage to keep this under control and this gets wrapped up in the same way that SARS or MERS did in the past 10 years, the Middle East respiratory system, if these outbreak, if that can be resolved in this way, if Corona can be resolved in this way, then it will only be a short-term hit to China's GDP, maybe over the next 6 months or something like that.
Absolutely, indeed. Now, how badly do you think all of this is likely to impact the businesses in China?
Only if it really spins out of control in the next 6 months, right? If it looks like the Chinese can't get this thing under control and it's going to genuinely impact foreign investment, right? If foreigners stop coming, if the travel bans on Chinese airlines and things like that actually dig in for months and months on end, then it will impact. But Chinese, to be fair to them, the Chinese have a fairly good record of dealing with these kinds of things in the past. So I think it's a little bit premature. But if it does really spin out of control, and there are a lot of rumors that what's going on in Wuhan is not what the government is telling us, then yeah, then it could lead to a major correction.
Absolutely, indeed. Now, there are reports that say that the Chinese government tried to keep a lid on the reports that were emerging out of Wuhan, and there was a missed opportunity for the Chinese government in trying to control this disease at its very outbreak. There's this huge controversy that is doing the rounds on the doctor who'd first come out and said that this virus looks very similar to the 2002-2003 SARS outbreak. It could be a coronavirus. Right. And then he was actually taken to task by the administration in Wuhan. How does all of this play out for China?
Yeah, I think the real issue is that the Chinese Communist Party is deeply sensitive to foreign public opinion, right, particularly in the United States. And so the Chinese government response to these kinds of things is basically sort of to keep it under wraps as long as possible. I mean, we know this from authoritarian and totalitarian systems in the past. The Soviet Union responded in the same way to Chernobyl. The North Koreans responded in the same way during the famine in the late 1990s. These kinds of states just don't like to admit that they've had failures, most obviously because that reflects back on the party and on the leadership, right? The Chinese Communist Party hasn't been elected. Its claim to legitimacy is through performance, right, that it does a good job, right, not because it's been elected. And if the Chinese government looks like it's not fixing this problem, then it impacts the legitimacy that it has in the eyes of its people. So I think that's why the Chinese lied to us for months about it.
Absolutely, indeed. And how much do you think this is likely to impact Xi Jinping, who'd been virtually unchallenged for pretty much the last 8 years? The biggest challenge, it appeared, had come to him from Hong Kong, but now he's dealing with a completely different kind of challenge within his own nation.
Yeah, that's right. And that's actually a really good point, because this isn't something that you can just send in the tanks like you can in Tiananmen Square or possibly in Hong Kong. This really shows that the Chinese have got to have like an improved medical system, and the Chinese have to be more transparent, and the scientific complex in China has to be more open to foreign involvement. All those things the Chinese Communist Party is not very good at, right? The WHO has been sort of sneaking around trying to sort of suggest that China needs to be more transparent. Like I said, I think if this thing can be wrapped up in the next 3 or 4 months in the same way that SARS was, then Xi will come out of it okay. But if we're still talking about this, if you and I are still having this conversation come the fall, in 6 months or something like that, yeah, then it's a real problem for him.
Absolutely, indeed. And also in terms of the impact that it has on businesses. For instance, Airbus has stopped its production line in Tian. Honda, Hyundai, Toyota, General Motors, just to speak of a few of the companies, they've all suspended their operations within China. This has badly, of course, impacted the supply chains. You know, how much of an impact will this have on the Chinese economy that is already flagging?
Yeah, my guess is this will probably knock Chinese GDP down for a couple of quarters. I'm not sure if this will push China into a recession. I mean, China's been growing so fast for so long. That would be remarkable. Again, a lot of it depends on whether or not the CCP can get this thing under control, as it has with outbreaks in the past, right? I mean, there's sort of a lot of, like, paranoia, I think, you know, driven by movies and stuff like that. When these things happen, it's going to be a pandemic, and we're going to be worrying about this thing, you know, the apocalypse and stuff like that. That kind of stuff doesn't really happen, right? I mean, we've seen these kinds of things before. My guess is the Chinese will get this under control. You'll see supply chain interruption, but they'll be resumed. This will only really impact China if it becomes a kind of Hollywood scenario, right? With, like, people wandering the streets and it's sort of flooding, you know, flying from one state to another, from one country to another. And so far it's been reasonably well contained. It's sort of not you know, the zombie apocalypse and stuff like that. So I'm a little bit wary about sort of, like, for example, the Commerce Secretary of the United States saying this is good for American industry. It's going to send jobs back to the U.S. You know, maybe for like a month or two. And then when this thing goes away over the summer, no one will be saying that. So I think we all need to sort of be a little bit more cautious about saying that this is going to really shift Chinese investment patterns. That's really unlikely unless this thing is just horrific and spins out of control.
And also, Mr. Kelly, you know, looking at this from the near to and a long-term scenario, you know, how badly do you think this is likely to affect businesses globally? It will have an impact on China, but for the rest of the world, what do you think will its impact be?
I think it'll be pretty limited. Again, we've seen outbreaks like this in the past, and they generally have not sort of exploded into, you know, again, the apocalyptic kind of Hollywood scenarios. I think that we've all sort of watched on TV too many times. Assuming that the Chinese government can control this, it shouldn't really shift patterns too much. It really shouldn't impact China's relations with its neighbors too much. I think what's most interesting about it actually is it's revealing how sensitive the Chinese are to public opinion. It looks like the Chinese are leaning on the countries around them not to impose these travel bans and stuff like that. It's showing China sort of at its most sensitive, particularly the Chinese Communist Party at its most touchy, right? That sort of, there's all this sort of hype about whether or not Chinese citizens can fly to places and stuff like that. I think that the political outcome of this is more revealing than economic interruptions in the future.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Mr. Kelly, for getting us all those insights in terms of the impact the novel corona outbreak is likely to have on the Chinese and indeed the global economy.